June 4th, 1944. North Atlantic Ocean, 150 miles off the coast of West Africa. The sea was a vast sheet of grey steel, rolling under a ceiling of low clouds. Rain streaked the horizon, and the wind carried the salt spray like shards of glass. Beneath that storm, the German submarine U-505 crept silently through the dark depths. A steel predator built for destruction now hunted itself. Inside the U-boat, the air was thick with diesel fumes and sweat. The crew of 59 men worked in near silence, every sound amplified in the cramped metal hull. The hum of the engines was the heartbeat of their existence. Each man knew one mistake could mean death by depth charge. At the control room stood Oberleutnant Harold Lange, the commanding officer. He was young, only in his mid-30s, yet the months at sea had carved deep lines into his face. The last few missions had gone poorly. Allied ships had grown smarter, their sonar sharper, their aircraft deadlier. Lange gripped the periscope handles and peered into the gloom above. The Atlantic looked empty, but every man aboard knew that. Allied hunter-killer groups were out there, destroyer escorts sweeping the seas with radar and sonar, waiting for a blip that would give away the submarine's position. A radio man, sweat dripping from his temple, turned to Lange. "Sir, Enigma." "Transmission received from command," he said. Lange nodded, taking the message. The order was simple. Patrol the western approaches, intercept Allied shipping, report positions. Nothing out of the ordinary, yet his instinct screamed otherwise. For weeks they'd been hounded. The Allies seemed to know where they were before they even arrived. The U-boat crews whispered about it, that the Americans had cracked their codes, that something in Berlin had gone terribly wrong. But such talk was forbidden. Above the surface, the storm built into a monstrous roar. The submarine pitched and groaned. Waves pounded its hull like cannon fire. "Dive to 70 meters, Lange ordered. "Diving, sir." The U-505 descended into the cold darkness, disappearing into a world of pressure and silence. Hours later, when the watch changed and the crew settled into their routines, the sonar operator stiffened. A faint ping echoed through the metal skin of the U-boat, distant, rhythmic, growing closer. "Sir, sonar contact, bearing 280, sounds like propellers, multiple." Lange's eyes narrowed. "How far?" "Closing fast." On the surface, 5 American warships of Task Group 22.3, commanded by Captain Daniel V. Gallery, sliced through the waves. At the heart of the formation was the USS Guadalcanal, an escort carrier loaded with Grumman TBF Avenger bombers. Flanking her were destroyer escorts, USS Chatelain, USS Pillsbury, USS Jenks, and USS Flaherty, each bristling with depth charges, hedgehog launchers, and sonar arrays tuned for one purpose: to hunt and kill U-boats. Gallery, a naval aviator, turned U-boat hunter, leaned over the plotting table on the bridge of the Guadalcanal. "We've lost 3 ships this month alone," he said quietly to his executive officer. "We're not letting another one get away." Moments later, a radio crackled to life aboard the Chatelain. "Sonar contact! Submarine! Bearing 275, range 1,800 yards!" The chase began. The Chatelain swung hard to port. Sonar pings growing faster, sharper. The crew sprinted to battle stations, hands on throttles, hearts pounding. On the carrier's deck, Avengers roared to life, their engines screaming as they launched into the storm. Below, U-505's hull shuddered violently. The first series of depth charges exploded above them, thunderclaps of destruction rolling through the water. Lights flickered, gauges trembled, a pipe burst near the engine room. "Damage report," Lange shouted. "Minor flooding aft. Pumps. Engaged." Another barrage detonated, closer this time. Men were thrown from their stations. The hull groaned under the pressure. Evasive maneuvers. Change depth to 100 meters. Hard starboard. But it was too late. The sonar pings were everywhere now, the Americans closing in from all sides. Up on the surface, Lieutenant Commander Dudley Morton aboard the Chatelaine gritted his teeth as he watched his sonar screen. "Target steady! Fire, hedgehogs!" Ripple of projectiles arced into the sea, sinking in deadly silence before erupting beneath the waves. One exploded directly beneath U-505's stern. The shockwave tore through compartments, disabling steering and flooding the engine room. Inside, the submarine chaos reigned. Men screamed orders, water surged through the deck plates, and smoke filled the corridors. "Emergency blow!" Lang roared. "Blow ballast tanks!" Compressed air roared into the tanks, a desperate gamble to surface before the ocean crushed them. Then, with a violent lurch, U-505 burst through the surface, a mangled beast rising from the depths, smoke and steam spilling from its hatches. On the Chatelaine's bridge, Morton blinked in disbelief. "She's surfacing! The bastard's coming up!" Normally, a surfacing U-boat meant one thing: abandon ship. The crew would scuttle the vessel, destroy their codes, and surrender. But as the Americans watched through binoculars, there was something strange. The deck gun was unmanned. The conning tower hatch was open, and no one was firing. The Germans were abandoning ship, but in their panic, they had failed to destroy their vessel. On board the Guadalcanal, Captain Gallery's eyes widened as realization struck. "My God! She's intact." He turned to his officers. "We're not sinking her. We're taking her." No one in the U.S. Navy had ever attempted such a thing. Capturing a live U-boat, complete with its Enigma machine and codebooks, was considered impossible. The risk was enormous. The enemy could have set scuttling charges. The submarine could sink at any moment. But Gallery saw what no one else dared to imagine: a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. "Prepare a boarding party," he barked. "We're going to steal a submarine." The rain hammered down, waves crashing over the carriers. Deck as sailors scrambled to their stations. The Chatelaine, still circling the crippled U-505, held fire, waiting for orders. The German submarine lay dead in the water, drifting slowly, her crew scattered in lifeboats, terrified, defeated, and unaware that their most valuable secrets were about to fall into enemy hands. The impossible was about to begin. The sea churned violently around the crippled U-505, waves crashing over her slick black hull. The submarine rolled dangerously, half submerged, its bow rising and falling as if gasping for breath. Every minute that passed brought her closer to sinking and taking her secrets with her. On the USS Guadalcanal, Captain Daniel Gallery gripped the railing, his eyes fixed on the floundering U-boat through binoculars. "She's going under," muttered one of his officers. Gallery lowered the glasses. "Not yet, she's not." He turned sharply. "Get me Lieutenant Albert David, now." Moments later, Lieutenant J.G. Albert Leroy David, a stocky, calm-eyed officer from the destroyer escort USS Pillsbury, appeared on the carrier's bridge. David was known for his steady nerves and clear judgment, the kind of man you wanted when the sea and enemy both turned against you. Gallery pointed toward the smoking submarine. "Lieutenant, that U-boat is intact. Her crew abandoned her in a panic. She's taking on water, but she's still afloat. I want her. Take a boarding team, secure the vessel, and recover anything of intelligence value before she sinks." David's expression didn't change, but he understood instantly what was being asked. No one had ever attempted to board an enemy submarine. Still afloat in combat conditions, the vessel could explode, sink, or be booby-trapped. But orders were orders. "Aye, sir," David replied simply. Within minutes, a small motor whaleboat from the Pillsbury was lowered into the raging Atlantic. The team aboard consisted of 8 men, machinists, signalmen, and seamen armed with sidearms and submachine guns. They had no idea what waited inside that steel coffin. The moment the boat hit the water, waves nearly capsized it. Spray blinded them as they fought to keep course. The smell of burning oil hung in the air. Ahead, U-505 loomed, a towering shadow rolling on its side, its conning tower half submerged, seawater pouring through open vents. "Keep her steady," David shouted over the roar of the wind. "Alongside, port side, easy." The boat slammed against the submarine's hull with a metallic crunch. The men threw grappling hooks and hauled themselves up, boots slipping on the slick surface. Every inch upward was a battle against gravity and fear. When David finally pulled himself onto the deck, he paused. The silence was eerie. No gunfire, no movement, just the hiss of escaping steam and the rhythmic slap of the ocean. "Anyone see any krauts?" shouted one of the sailors. "Negative," came the reply. David pointed toward the conning tower. "You, with me. The rest secure the hatch." The hatch was partially open, smoke billowing out in lazy grey tendrils. David peered inside, total darkness, punctuated by the faint red glow of emergency lights. The air reeked of diesel and seawater. He descended the ladder. His boots splashed into ankle-deep water. "Careful," he warned, "she's flooding fast." One by one, the team entered the submarine. They moved cautiously through the cramped corridors, past bunks still warm, coffee cups still half full, clothing scattered across the floor. It felt like the crew had vanished mid-breath. "Sir," one sailor called out, "torpedo room's flooding. Pumps offline." David turned toward the control room. Gauges were shattered, but the electrical panels still flickered weakly. "Find the sea valves," he ordered. "Shut everything that's open. Keep her afloat as long as we can." The men scrambled, twisting wheels and slamming hatches. The submarine groaned but held together. Then, in the captain's cabin, David found it, an Enigma machine still bolted to the table untouched. Nearby were boxes of codebooks, signal logs, and cipher keys, the holy grail of naval intelligence. He froze for a moment, realizing the magnitude of what lay before him. These codes could unlock the secrets of the entire German U-boat fleet. "Bag everything," he shouted. "Take the Enigma, take the books, don't leave a thing." Back on the surface, the Pillsbury had moved dangerously close to assist. Captain Gallery, watching through binoculars, clenched his jaw as he saw the boarding team vanish into the hatch. The U-505 was riding lower in the water now. Every passing second meant greater risk. "Signal the Flaherty," Gallery ordered. "Prepare a tow line." The destroyer escort maneuvered into position, sailors tossing heavy cables over the waves. Twice the line snapped, whipped away by the current. Finally, on the third attempt, it held. Inside the submarine, David and his men had collected what they could. He gave the order to withdraw. But as they climbed back to the deck, he noticed something odd. The U-505 wasn't sinking anymore. The quick patching of valves and hatches had worked. The vessel was battered, flooded, but alive. "Sir, she's steady," a sailor said, disbelief in his voice. David nodded. "Then we're not letting her go." As the tow line tightened, the crippled U-boat lurched forward, an enemy ship, being dragged by American steel. From above, the scene was surreal, the stars and stripes fluttering over the captured Kriegsmarine emblem, rain pouring down as the waves broke around both vessels. It was the first time in U.S. Navy history that an enemy submarine had been captured intact. When David returned to the Guadalcanal, drenched and exhausted, Captain Gallery met him on the deck. "Lieutenant," Gallery said with a rare grin, "you just stole a German U-boat." David saluted. "Yes, sir, she's all yours, but the mission wasn't over yet. The U-505 was still deep in enemy waters, and word of her capture could bring the full fury of the Kriegsmarine down on them. Worse, if Berlin learned she'd been taken, they'd change their codes immediately, rendering all that intelligence worthless. The Americans had done the impossible. Now they had to make sure no one found out. The storm finally began to break as dawn crept over the Atlantic. Pale light spread across the heaving sea, revealing a sight no one aboard Task Group 22.3 would ever forget. The German submarine U-505, towed behind American ships like a ghost pulled from the deep. Her hull was cracked and bruised, the black paint scorched by explosions, but she was alive. For the men on deck, the adrenaline had begun to fade, replaced by awe. A few dared to laugh, others just stared in silence. The ocean, once an invisible battlefield, now held a trophy, one that could alter the war itself. Captain Daniel Gallery stood on the bridge of the USS Guadalcanal, his binoculars hanging loosely from his neck. "Get a tarp over that hull number," he ordered suddenly. "I don't want anyone knowing who she is." The crew obeyed immediately. Within minutes, sailors draped heavy canvas over the U-boat's conning tower, concealing the markings U-505. Gallery turned to his communications officer. "Radio silence from here on out. Not one word leaves this task group. If anyone asks, we sank her." The order rippled through the fleet like an electric current. The capture of U-505 was to be classified at the highest level. Not even the families of the men involved would be told. On board the carrier, Lieutenant Albert David and his exhausted boarding party were escorted to the sick bay. Their faces were pale, their hands cut and blistered from the climb and the fight with the flooding. A medic stitched a wound on David's arm, but his mind was elsewhere, on the Enigma machine and the stacks of codebooks they'd pulled from. The submarine. An intelligence officer entered, his expression grave. "You realize what you brought back, Lieutenant? This could shorten the war." David simply nodded. He wasn't thinking of glory. He was thinking of how close they'd come to dying inside that steel coffin. Meanwhile, aboard the destroyer USS Pillsbury, sailors had rescued 58 surviving German crewmen from the sea. They were shivering, shell-shocked, and terrified, some convinced they'd be executed on sight. Captain Gallery's voice came over the intercom. "Treat them well. They're prisoners of war now. But remember, not a word about what we've taken. They think their boat is on the bottom of the Atlantic, and that's exactly what Berlin needs to believe." The prisoners were stripped of any identification, isolated from one another, and kept under armed guard. When they were later transferred to a secret compound in Louisiana, even their letters home were censored to hide the truth. The deception was total. Back on the open sea, the Americans faced a new challenge, towing a crippled U-boat across more than 1,500 miles of Atlantic waters without it sinking. Every few hours, sailors went aboard to pump out flooding compartments, patch cracks and secure cables. The sea tested them relentlessly, tossing the fragile convoy like driftwood. "Keep her nose up!" shouted one of the engineers as another. Waves slammed over the bow. "If she goes under again, she's gone for good." Day by day, they fought to keep her afloat. The destroyers formed a tight escort screen, their sonar operators scanning constantly for any sign of approaching U-boats. If a German sub spotted them towing one of their own, the attack would be immediate and merciless. Captain Gallery knew it. "If they find us," he said to his officers one night, "they'll send everything they've got. We'd better pray the sea keeps our secret." By some miracle, it did. On June 19, 1944, the battered U-505 reached Bermuda, her decks still dripping with salt water and oil. As she was pulled into the harbour, sailors and officers alike gathered silently to watch. An enemy submarine sailing under American control. Gallery exhaled for what felt like the first time in days. "Gentlemen," he said quietly, "we just made naval history." But for the next year, the U-505 might as well have vanished again. She was hidden within a heavily guarded dockyard, covered and sealed, surrounded by fences and armed marines. Engineers swarmed over her, cataloguing every valve, gauge and weapon. Intelligence teams dissected her communication equipment, torpedo systems, and the Enigma machine itself. Each discovery brought new revelations, innovative hull designs that allowed deeper dives, advanced torpedo targeting systems, and, most importantly, encryption methods that could now be broken in Allied code rooms. For the cryptographers working under Admiral Ernest King and the Office of Naval Intelligence, U-505 was a goldmine. Every captured codebook and cipher key unlocked the positions of other U-boats across the Atlantic. Within weeks, Allied convoys began to pass through zones that had once been death traps. The hunters had become the hunted, but the men who had made it possible were forbidden to speak. When Gallery's task group returned to the United States, their orders were explicit. The operation was classified top secret. The crew's logbooks were seized, and official reports stated only that U-505 had been destroyed. Not even the president could publicly acknowledge what had happened. For Lieutenant Albert David, the hero who'd entered the submarine under fire and salvaged its secrets, recognition came quietly. Months later, in a closed ceremony, he was awarded the Medal of Honor, the only one given to a sailor for heroism in anti-submarine warfare during World War II. He would never live to see the world learn the truth. David died the following year of natural causes at just 34 years old. The U-505, meanwhile, remained a ghost, its existence erased from official records, its story buried under layers of secrecy. To the Germans, it was another U-boat lost to the depths. To the Allies, it was the silent weapon that turned the tide of the Battle of the Atlantic. But one day, long after the war ended, that ghost would surface again, not as a weapon, but as a monument to the impossible. The years after the war were quiet for U-505, at least on the surface. Hidden away in the warm waters of Bermuda, the submarine lay in silence, her engines dead, her once deadly torpedo tubes sealed shut. Rust began to bloom across her hull, the salty air eating away at the steel that had once terrorized Allied convoys. To most of the sailors who had served aboard her, the war was over and forgotten, but for a few, those who had seen her capture, with their own eyes, the memory never faded. Captain Daniel Gallery returned home to Chicago as a decorated officer, though his achievement was still cloaked in secrecy. He had risked his career, even court-martial, by choosing to capture rather than sink an enemy submarine. And though the official reports had been sanitized, the Navy eventually recognized his daring command as one of the boldest operations of the Atlantic campaign. By the early 1950s, with the Cold War now in full swing, the captured submarine had little practical use. The Navy considered scrapping her, melting down her steel for parts. But Gallery, ever stubborn and fiercely proud of his men, refused to let her vanish. In 1954, he launched a campaign to save U-505. "She's a piece of history," he told reporters. "We risked our lives to bring her home, and by God, she deserves better than the scrapyard." The idea sounded absurd at first, transporting a full-sized German U-boat from Bermuda to the mainland United States and putting it on display in a museum. But Gallery was relentless. He had connections, charisma, and a city that loved him. And Chicago listened. The Museum of Science and Industry, one of the largest museums in the country, agreed to take U-505. But the logistics were staggering. The submarine weighed over 700 tons. To move her, engineers would have to tow her by sea, haul her onto land, and drag her through city streets. The journey began in 1954, when the Navy towed the submarine from Bermuda to New Orleans, then up the Mississippi River to Chicago. Crowds lined the banks to watch the strange procession, a captured German war machine making its way through America's heartland. When she arrived at Chicago's lakefront, thousands gathered to witness her final voyage. Reporters, veterans, families, all drawn to see the ghost of the Atlantic War rise once more into daylight. To get her into the museum grounds, workers spent weeks digging a massive trench and laying railroad tracks. Inch by inch, cranes and winches pulled the submarine into place. The operation took 19 days, an engineering feat nearly as daring as her wartime capture. Finally, on September 25, 1954, U-505 opened to the public. For the first time, the full story could be told. Visitors who stepped inside were struck by the claustrophobic maze of metal, the narrow corridors, the rows of torpedo tubes, the dials and gauges still marked with German script. The air smelled faintly of oil and salt, as if the sea still lingered inside. Gallery himself gave tours in the early years, telling the story with the same intensity he'd carried on the bridge of the Guadalcanal. He spoke not of conquest, but of courage, of the risks taken by both sides, and of how close they had come to destroying one another. War, he told one group of students, isn't about trophies, it's about survival, and the hope that someday men won't have to fight it again. For the former crew of U-505, news of the submarine's survival was a shock. Many had believed she was destroyed that day in 1944. When the truth emerged decades later, they were astonished, and for some, grateful. In 1964, 20 years after her capture, several surviving German crew members visited the museum. Among them was Hans Goebeler, a machinist who had served aboard during her final patrol. He ran his hands along the steel hull, tears welling in his eyes. "I thought she was gone," he said softly. "She was our home and our prison." The meeting between former enemies was quiet, respectful, almost reverent. Goebeler and other veterans met with some of the American sailors who had captured them. Old soldiers, grey-haired now, shaking hands where once they had exchanged fire. It was a strange kind of reconciliation, the U-505 no longer a weapon, but a bridge between those who fought. Over the decades that followed, millions of visitors would walk through her narrow halls. Children pressed buttons and peered through periscopes. Veterans paused in silence, and historians marveled at the miracle of her survival. The submarine that had once prowled the depths now rested in peace, not as a relic of war, but as a lesson from it. In 2004, 50 years after her arrival, the Museum of Science and Industry completed a massive restoration. U-505 was moved into a climate-controlled underground exhibit, protected from the elements, preserved for future generations. As she was lowered into her new home, spotlights illuminated her scarred hull. On her side, the faint outline of her wartime number, 505, still showed through layers of paint. It was as if the ocean's ghost had finally found its harbor. The air inside the museum was still and cool, broken only by the murmured voices of visitors and the soft hum of lighting panels. There she stood, U-505, preserved under glass and steel, suspended between memory and myth. Her once lethal silhouette now cast shadows across polished floors instead of open seas. For many who walked her decks, she represented something far greater than a machine of war. She was a story of courage, fear, and the razor's edge between survival and annihilation. In the dim light of her control room, the brass wheels and levers gleamed faintly. The German labels, Tiefenmesser, Ruder, Notventil, whispered, reminders of another world, another time. Every gauge, every dent, every scorch mark carried the echo of a moment when death had been measured in meters below the surface. Visitors often paused before the Enigma machine displayed beside her. Its keys, worn smooth by hands long gone, were the same ones that once encrypted orders from the Kriegsmarine, commands that sent men into the abyss. The thought lingered heavily. These same keys had, for a brief moment, held the fate of nations. To historians, U-505's capture remains one of the most extraordinary naval operations of World War II, an act of audacity and precision that few believed possible. The decision by Captain Daniel Gallery to seize rather than sink her defied every standing order, every instinct drilled into anti-submarine warfare. It was a gamble that could have ended in catastrophe, but it didn't. The intelligence recovered from her, including cipher keys and signal procedures, fed directly into Allied code-breaking operations. Within weeks, the Allies could predict U-boat movements, reroute convoys, and turn hunter into hunted. The ocean that had once been a graveyard for Allied sailors became a killing ground for the German wolf packs. Historians estimate that the information gathered from U-505 saved countless lives, not just of sailors, but of civilians whose supplies and fuel crossed the Atlantic unmolested. Her capture didn't just change a battle, it accelerated the collapse of a war. Yet what truly endures is the human story. The German crew, young men barely out of their teens, had gone to sea believing in duty, not destiny. They were trapped by orders, by ideology, by the iron cage of war. When their submarine surfaced in surrender, most were relieved to see daylight, to breathe air that didn't smell of oil and fear. The Americans who faced them, men like Albert David, weren't fighting monsters, but mirrors. Both sides were bound by fear, courage, and the will to survive another day. When the guns fell silent and the sea stopped burning, what remained was a shared understanding of what the ocean had taken from them. In later years, when former crewmen from both sides met at memorial events, there was no bitterness, only quiet respect. Some even called each other friends. Captain Gallery himself reflected on that strange bond near the end of his life. "When we captured her," he wrote, "we didn't just take a submarine. We captured a moment in history when men remembered that bravery isn't owned by one flag. It lives in anyone who dares to defy the impossible." Today, the U-505 stands as one of only 4 German U-boats left in existence, and the only one ever captured by the United States Navy. Her story, told in documentaries, classrooms, and museum halls, continues to inspire those who hear it. For schoolchildren who step inside her narrow corridors, the war feels impossibly far away, a relic of another century. Yet if you listen closely, amid the creak of metal and the soft hum of recorded sonar sounds, you can almost hear the sea outside, the depth charges, the voices shouting orders in German and English alike. It's as if the Atlantic itself still echoes within her. Every year, veterans' families gather at the museum to honor the men who risked everything that day in June 1944. They stand beneath the submarine's towering hull, heads bowed, remembering those who didn't return on both sides. A plaque near the exhibit's entrance bears the inscription, "To those who served beneath the waves and those who brought them home. The U-505 did the impossible. She surfaced when no one believed she could. She survived when every force on Earth tried to pull her under. And long after the last guns of war went silent, she became something else entirely. Not a symbol of conquest, but of courage." In the end, that may be her greatest legacy. From the depths of the Atlantic to the heart of Chicago, the submarine, they said would never surface, proved that even in war, especially in war, the impossible is sometimes only the beginning.